that Caesar was superior to everyone, when in fact, no, Caesar was not superior. Caesar was just another person like anybody else.
Yeah,
Everybody's equal in the eyes of God. That's the point.
Exactly.
Yeah. One of the things that I find interesting, and this harkens back to a conversation that Glenn Jacobs and I had, Mark, is the way that conservatives do depict themselves as supposedly law and order types of people and things like that, where they say, oh, yes, we've been granted a special place in the world by God, and the laws that we had for so long really functioned well, and so on and so forth. Well, you can talk to some of the people at the time of the founding. There were mistakes that were made back then, and there were a lot of rights that were infringed upon by people and coercion that occurred even during the presidency of George Washington. So, and of course, we know that the very existence of the government is itself an infringement on rights. So there is no way that a Christian can answer and say, well, the government that we have was granted to us by God, because God would not grant a government that forcibly took from people in order to protect people. He just wouldn't do that. And he would not want people, I believe, he would not want people to say that they're going to live under some other ruler when they're supposed to have one ruler and decide their morality themselves. It's impossible to exercise one's own morality unless he can choose. And he cannot choose if government is constantly telling him how to live and has penalties such as imprisonment or seizure of his property. What I think is fascinating is that this whole rule of law concept, as we mentioned before, has been synonymous with the so-called protection of rights, which we've shown and deconstructed to show that is an erroneous assumption, an erroneous and fallacious assumption that they should be tied together. But also, Glenn and I were talking about how I came to realize that you don't really need the term rights, as you were saying. You can have a term societally agreed to modes of behavior, which is very clunky.
Right.
And
I like relationships.
Yes, relationships. That's very, very good. And how would you address someone who said, well, are you telling us that we have to have relationships? Are you saying that just by saying this, couldn't it be misconstrued, Mark Canney, to say people have to have relationships with one another? And then I'll tell you a little bit about what Glenn and I were discussing.
Well, no, that's not. Hopefully that's. It's clear that goes against everything that we've been saying. In that, we want a situation where there's no force. Yes. There may be.
Goes back to the Trinity.
Yeah, it goes back to Trinity. It goes back to relationships, and I think what happens sometimes is we're having all these conversations in the context of how does a community, how do the individuals in a community relate to each other, and I think what happened with the movement of socialism is that they may, I'll give them this, I think they may have started from a point of well intentions because they knew that there's just tremendous value in the community. We want to value the community. We want to be able to help each other out. But when that community becomes institutionalized and relationships are now based on force, then it loses all the value of the community.
Yeah.
If I'm gonna, at that point, if I'm being forced through my tax money to pay for different social programs, and something happens to someone in my direct family, I have less resources to put towards their situation and helping them. And so, in effect, the community, at its very most organic, fundamental level, being the family, is completely destroyed.
Yes.
And we see the workings out of that in statistics concerning divorce and single-parent homes, and I certainly have a lot of praise and a lot of respect for those who are able to get through those situations. But it's because of government is a strong reason why it's much harder than it has to be for a lot of people.
Well, that's interesting. And Mark, so many people, if they were to hear this idea of relationships or, my term, societally accepted modes of behavior, outside of government, it's so alien to them. They look at it and they say, look, we've had hundreds of years of laws to protect people's rights, and I just don't buy into your argument that it's a bad thing to have certain rights given up by people. I think some people would say, I would even say that, yeah, some people have to be forced to give up some of their rights, but as long as it's limited, as long as it's kept to a limited amount, because we have to have some body that will write down the laws and keep law and order. It goes all the way back, they say, to the very time of the Magna Carta, when they wrote down certain rules about the common law and things like that. And what I think is very interesting is, I was having a conversation with Glenn about this, and I said, Glenn, I was thinking about my idea of written law, and how I think that there was a mistake that was made when the laws were written down. He said, well, Gard, it's not bad if you want to write down rules. I mean, everybody writes down rules for contracts and things like that, and agreements between themselves, as long as it's done voluntarily. The problem is that during the years, there were certain people who could read and write and so on, and the people who had established the verbal common law and the societal modes of behavior throughout Europe, they had them written down later on so that they would be able to see them, and they'd be written down and other people could recognize them. But unfortunately, over time, they started to cede more power to the people who could write these things. This isn't what Glenn is saying now. I'm sort of getting into what I've been saying. And over time, they started to cede this power for writing the laws. Once they started to have people beyond the law recorders, they started to become lawmakers.
Yeah.
And once they became lawmakers, and this is Glenn's point, once they became lawmakers, then all stops were pulled, because then they perpetuate their power and they do anything to keep themselves going. And I think that that's an excellent point. I had spoken to Glenn a little bit about the Ten Commandments, and I said, Glenn, I have this thing about written law, and I don't know, I was thinking about the Ten Commandments because those laws were supposedly written by God, and is it wrong to think that those laws were wrong too? He said, well, Gard, those weren't government laws. Those were laws that were given to God, and you could voluntarily agree to abide by them or not. They were if you wanted to enter the kingdom of heaven, if you wanted to live a moral life, this is what God said. Here are the rules. And later on, Ferb Furbish of the Freedom Book Club, he cited for me a great piece on the history of the Jews and how they didn't really have government for the longest time. They had the Ten Commandments, but those were laws that were given to them not by government, but by God. And I think the final determination here that we have is that government laws and rights are incompatible. You cannot put them together, especially even if you think you are a supposed conservative Christian person. You can't accept this fallacy that God grants government a special purview to protect your rights, because Christ certainly didn't agree with that. He didn't think that the Romans were protecting people's rights. He didn't think that the Jewish oligarchs, who were the religious oligarchs there, were protecting people's rights. The Pharisees weren't doing a very good job. Clearly, what he meant was there's one king. He gives you the ability to be a moral mover, and you make your choice among other people.
Absolutely.
And Moses had those rules written down. And I think, hopefully, people who believe in the supposed rule of law will recognize that you can have order without government law.
Absolutely. I think you really encapsulated it well there.
Well, Mark, let me ask you a question. What about the idea, sort of playing devil's advocate here again, the idea that, especially among some Christians, that you've got to submit to this some sort of authority, the government authority, even if it does make mistakes occasionally, and then you try to correct those mistakes, but you don't tear down the whole edifice?
Yeah, that's a very challenging question, and you know, so a lot of Christians are drawing from Scripture when they have that objection. Some of the writings of Paul, and in particular in I believe it's the first epistle or first letter of Peter, somewhere in the second chapter, where he's saying that we need to be submissive to the government, even if we're unjust. And he even takes the steps, and he talks about slavery and indentured servants, and saying that, you know, even you guys who are in probably the most unjust place in society, if you know, you need to submit to authority. And I mean, he certainly gives a caveat and says, if you have a chance to be free, if you have a way to buy yourself out of slavery or servitude, then take that. But unless that happens, then, you know, you need to be humble and serve in that position, which is incredibly difficult. But, you know, but I think the response to that is quite simple.